The man who wrestled with God. There are stories in the Bible that we read once and quickly forget. And then, there are those that grip us, hold us, speak to us in ways we never expected, because somehow, they are not just about them. They're about us. This is one of those stories. It's the story of a man who was born fighting. A man who spent his life running from his past, from the truth, from himself. A man who would one day find himself locked in a supernatural struggle with God. You heard that right. A man who wrestled with God and walked away transformed. But he didn't walk away the same. He limped, marked forever by the moment that changed everything. This isn't just a story about physical strength. It's about surrender. About scars. About identity. Because sometimes, in order to find out who we really are, we have to stop pretending. We have to face the mess we've made. We have to stop running. And when we do, that's when the real fight begins. This is not a fairy tale. This is not a legend. This is ancient. And it's real. It's about Jacob, the heel grabber, the deceiver, the schemer. But it's also about redemption, restoration, and the miracle of becoming someone new. And maybe, just maybe, it's also about you. Because what if the thing you're fighting the most is actually the invitation you need? What if the pain you're carrying is part of the transformation? And what if the struggle you're in right now isn't proof that you're losing, but evidence that God is not done with you yet? This is the story of the man who wrestled with God. And once you hear it, you'll never forget it. A struggle before birth. Before he ever took his first breath, before he opened his eyes to see the world, Jacob was already in a fight. The Bible tells us that even in the womb, Jacob and his twin brother Esau were at war. Two lives tangled together in their mother's belly, struggling for dominance, for space, for something deeper, something invisible, something spiritual. And if you've ever felt like there's a war inside you, between who you are and who you're supposed to be, then maybe you understand this story better than you think. This wasn't just a sibling rivalry. This was a metaphor for the human condition. From the very beginning, Jacob was reaching, grasping, striving, refusing to be second. And when the twins were finally born, Esau came first, but Jacob emerged right behind him, his tiny hand wrapped tightly around his brother's heel. Like he was saying, I won't let go. I won't be left behind. It's the kind of moment you don't forget. Not just because it's unusual, but because it says something. About identity. About desire. About the hunger to be seen, to be first, to matter. Jacob was named for what he did, the heel grabber. In Hebrew, Yaakov. But that name would come to mean so much more. Because Jacob wasn't just grasping at his brother's heel. He would spend his life grasping at destiny, at blessing, at love, at control. Maybe you know what that feels like. To want something so badly, you'll bend the rules to get it. To feel like the world is a race, and if you don't fight for your place, you'll be forgotten. From the womb, Jacob was a struggler. And that struggle, it didn't stop at birth. It would define every chapter of his life. And maybe, that's the point. Maybe the struggle isn't a mistake. Maybe the tension we feel inside us isn't something to hide from, but something to learn from. Because some of the deepest truths about who we are born not in peace, but in conflict. And from the very first heartbeat, Jacob was a man in conflict. Not just with Esau, but with himself. And eventually, with God. Grasping for identity from his earliest days, Jacob wasn't just chasing a blessing, he was chasing a name. A place. A sense of worth. And like so many of us, he believed the only way to get it was to earn it. To take it. Even if it meant pretending to be someone he wasn't. His father, Isaac, loved Esau, the older brother, the hunter, the outdoorsman. Esau was strong, rugged, masculine. The kind of son who made a father proud. But Jacob? He stayed close to home. Quiet. Watching. Waiting. Longing. Longing for the day his father would look at him and say, "You are enough. You are my son. You are blessed." But that day never came. So Jacob came up with a plan. A dangerous plan. A desperate plan. Isaac had grown old and blind, and it was time to pass on the family blessing. A sacred, prophetic moment. The kind of moment that shaped nations. And Jacob wanted it. Not just for the power it carried, but for the identity it offered. He wanted to be the chosen one. He wanted to be seen. So, with the help of his mother Rebekah, Jacob disguised himself as Esau. He wore his brother's clothes. He covered his arms in goat skin to mimic Esau's hair. And with trembling hands and a lying voice, he stepped into the room. Into the light. Pretending to be someone else. And his father, confused, uncertain, feeling but not seeing, reached out and touched what felt like Esau. "The voice is Jacob's," he said, "but the hands are Esau's." And in that moment, he gave the blessing. The words Jacob had longed to hear his entire life, came to him while he was wearing a mask. He got what he wanted, but not as himself. And that changes everything. Because when you have to pretend to be someone else to be loved, you never really feel loved. Not deep down. You just feel afraid. Afraid of being found out. Afraid the blessing will vanish the moment they see the real you. And isn't that how it works? So many of us live with the haunting question, if they knew the real me, would they still love me? Jacob walked out of that room with his father's blessing on his shoulders, but a storm in his soul. Because no matter how many words Isaac spoke, Jacob knew, he wasn't the man those words were meant for. And that's when the blessing turned into a curse. Because the moment Esau found out, everything unraveled. His brother's rage. His mother's panic. His father's silence. And Jacob, the man who got everything, had to run for his life. He had the blessing. But he had no peace. He had the name. But he had no identity. Because when you grasp for identity through deception, you may gain the world, but you'll lose yourself. The cost of a stolen blessing, the blessing was his. But peace was nowhere to be found. Jacob had deceived his father. Stolen from his brother. Taken what wasn't his, or at least, not his yet. And now, he was running. Not just from Esau, who burned with rage and vowed to kill him, but from home, from safety, and from the very identity he had tried to manufacture. Because here's the thing about pretending, eventually, the mask gets heavy. And no matter how perfectly you pull off the act, you can't outrun the truth forever. Jacob left in haste. No farewell hugs. No father's hand on his shoulder. No closure. Just distance. Fear. And silence. He was a fugitive of his own making. Carrying a blessing that had been spoken in deceit, wrapped in the weight of guilt, haunted by a brother's fury, and a father's doubt. He had reached the top, but felt lower than ever. Have you ever chased something so hard, only to realize that getting it cost you more than you could bear? That was Jacob. He had won, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like exile. And deep down, he had to wonder, was this blessing even real? Or had he forfeited the very thing he longed for by trying to take it the wrong way? The Bible says, whoever sows the wind will reap the whirlwind. That's Hosea chapter 8, verse 7. And Jacob's whirlwind had just begun. He ran through deserts, alone and empty, with no clear plan, just a destination, his uncle Laban's house, far away in Haran. But the journey itself became a mirror. A reflection. A wilderness not just of geography, but of the soul. Because when you lie to become someone you're not, you don't just deceive others, you fragment yourself. You can dress up in someone else's clothes, you can fake the voice, but when the sun sets and the adrenaline fades, you're left with the truth, you're still you. And you still don't know who that is. Jacob was blessed, but broken. He was chosen, but he was chasing. He had God's word spoken over him, but he didn't yet know God for himself. And maybe that's why God didn't abandon him. Because grace doesn't wait for perfection. It shows up in the mess. So in the middle of his escape, Jacob stops for the night. Nowhere to lay his head but a stone. And there, in a dream, he sees a ladder stretching from earth to heaven, angels ascending and descending. God speaks. Not to punish. Not to accuse. But to promise. I am with you. I will not leave you. What? After all the lying? After all the running? Yes. Because God doesn't bless masks. He blesses people, even broken ones. Even fearful ones. Even those who don't fully understand who they are yet. But Jacob didn't fully believe it. Not yet. He wakes up and says, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I didn't know it." And isn't that the ache of every wanderer? To find out. God was closer than we thought even when we felt most unworthy. The cost of a stolen blessing is real. It fractures relationships. It breeds fear. It sends us running. But it also becomes the soil, the unlikely soil, where transformation begins. And Jacob's transformation had only just begun. Exile and emptiness, he had the blessing. But not the peace. Jacob had run to save his life, but in the process, he had lost his sense of self. Now far from home, far from his brother, far from everything he'd ever known, Jacob entered a new chapter, one that looked like survival on the outside, but felt like exile on the inside. Because sometimes, the real exile isn't geographical. It's internal. You can be surrounded by people, working, building, appearing successful, and still feel lost. Still feel empty. Jacob arrived at his uncle Laban's house hoping for safety. What he found was something else entirely. Laban, a man as cunning as Jacob himself, welcomed him in, but the mirror was undeniable. For years, Jacob had been the deceiver. Now, he would taste his own medicine. It began with love. Jacob met Rachel, beautiful, radiant, full of life. For the first time in what felt like forever, his soul exhaled. He worked 7 years for her hand in marriage, and the Bible says, they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. But on the wedding night, Laban tricked him. Gave him Leah instead. Veiled. Hidden. Deception at its most intimate. And suddenly, Jacob became the victim of the very strategy he had once used. What he had done to his father, was now done to him. Only now, there were no blessings to show for it. Just confusion. Disappointment. Bitterness. He confronted Laban. Demanded Rachel. And Laban agreed, but only after Jacob promised to work another 7 years. 14 years. 14 years of labor, just to secure love. And yet, even with both wives, even with children, even with success beginning to grow, something inside Jacob remained unsettled. Because when you're not at peace with yourself, no amount of external stability can fix what's broken within. He had the love. He had the family. He had the wealth that would eventually come. But he did not have peace. Not yet. Because Jacob had still not faced his past. Not fully. He had not returned home. He had not seen his brother. He had not truly looked in the mirror. And until he did, the blessing would feel hollow. The love would feel fragile. And his name would still carry the weight of deception. There are seasons where we appear to have it all, but inside, we know something's missing. That was Jacob. Living in exile. Surrounded by life, but feeling lifeless. Because a blessing without peace is just a crown without a kingdom. A name without a soul. And Jacob's soul was still searching. Love that tests you. Love is supposed to make things easier, softer, safer. But sometimes, love becomes the very thing that tests you most. Jacob had fallen hard for Rachel. The moment he saw her, something inside him shifted. She wasn't just beautiful, she felt like hope. After all the lies, the running, the hiding, Rachel felt like a beginning. So he made a vow, he would work for her. 7 years. And he did. Not begrudgingly. Not with bitterness. He worked with joy. Because when you really love someone, the wait doesn't feel like waste. It feels like purpose. The years passed like days. And then, the wedding. The moment Jacob had waited for. But that night, under the cover of darkness, Laban made his move. He gave Jacob not Rachel, but Leah. And when the morning light broke, so did Jacob's heart. He had been tricked. Deceived. Violated. The very thing he had done to his father, pretending to be someone else, stealing the moment in disguise, had now been done to him. And that wound, cut deep. He demanded answers. And Laban, cold and calculated, said, "It's not our custom to marry off the younger before the older." The irony was painful. Jacob, the younger, who had stolen the place of the older, was now caught in a cycle of consequences he never saw coming. Still, he stayed. He agreed to work another 7 years. Not because it was fair, but because real love isn't proven by convenience. It's proven by endurance. So Jacob labored. 14 years. For the woman he loved. But love didn't make things simple. It made them complicated. Because now he had 2 wives. 2 sisters. 2 realities. Leah, the unloved. Rachel, the adored. And Jacob, caught in a web of tension he never intended to weave. Leah gave him children. Rachel gave him longing. And somewhere in the middle of this broken family dynamic, Jacob began to feel the weight of what love really costs. Not in romantic words. But in sacrifice. Frustration. Disappointment. Compromise. Love, he learned, is not always the rescue. Sometimes, it's the refining fire. Because love that doesn't stretch you won't change you. And Jacob was being stretched. Pulled between duty and desire, between passion and pain. He had chased Rachel like a dream. But God was using both women, both stories, to teach him something far more valuable than desire. He was learning how to stay. How to serve. How to lead. How to carry the weight of what he once thought would fulfill him. Because real love doesn't just elevate your heart. It exposes it. And through Leah and Rachel, Jacob was finally being confronted with the man he had become, and the man he still needed to become. Reaping what you sow, you can't outrun the harvest. For years, Jacob had planted seeds, of ambition, of deception, of control. He wore masks. Played roles. Bent truth to gain favor. And now, the soil was giving back. But not the way he expected. Laban, his uncle, was more than just family, he was a mirror. A man who could lie with a straight face. Who could manipulate circumstances. Who always seemed to have one more twist, one more condition, one more trap. At first, Jacob thought he could outsmart him. But Laban didn't just outsmart, he outplayed. The switch on the wedding night was only the beginning. Jacob spent 20 years under Laban's thumb. Working. Waiting. Negotiating for wages, for livestock, for stability. And every time the deal seemed fair, Laban would shift the terms. Move the goalposts. rewrite the rules. And Jacob, the man who once held all the power, was now the one being played. It was humiliating, frustrating, but also necessary. Because sometimes, God teaches us not with sermons, but with experience. He lets us feel what we made others feel. He lets us see who we really are, not in the victories, but in the struggle. Jacob was learning. Every unfair deal, every restless night, every disappointment. They weren't just life lessons, they were soul lessons. He was reaping what he had sown. But not because God was cruel. Because God was kind enough not to let Jacob stay the same. And somewhere in those hard, dry years, Jacob began to change. He became wiser, more patient, less reactive, more dependent. The man who had once stolen a blessing was now learning how to build a life. The boy who clung to his brother's heel was becoming a man who could stand on his own, even under pressure. And in the quiet of that long season, Jacob began to see God differently. Not just as a giver of dreams, or a voice from heaven, but as someone present in the grind, in the routine, in the waiting. Because God is not only in the dramatic moments. He's in the slow ones, the silent ones, the ones where nothing seems to change, but you do. Jacob had once taken shortcuts to get ahead. Now, he was learning to trust the long road. And even though the scars of his past still lingered, and the shadow of Esau still loomed, something was shifting. Jacob was no longer the man who ran. He was the man who endured. And every day he stayed, every day he fought not to fight, he was sowing something new. Character. Resilience. Faith. Because what you plant in pain can still produce beauty in time. And Jacob was finally learning how to sow well. Wrestling with the divine, some fights are louder than fists. They echo in the silence. In the dark. When you're alone with everything you've been running from. Jacob was no longer young. His beard had gray in it. His hands were calloused from work. His heart was heavier than ever. He had wives, children, flocks, wealth. But peace? Still out of reach. And now, the past was catching up. Esau, his brother, the one he had tricked and betrayed, was coming. With 400 men. This wasn't just a reunion. It felt like a reckoning. Jacob sent gifts ahead, hoping to soften his brother's anger. He divided his camp, strategized, prayed, but nothing could quiet the fear pulsing in his chest. So he sent everyone across the river. Wives, children, servants, everything. And Jacob stayed behind. Alone. In the dark. In the silence. In the space between who he was and who he had yet to become. And then, a man appeared. No introduction. No words. Just a sudden struggle. They wrestled. All night. Sweat. Dirt. Breathless tension. But this was no ordinary fight. This was divine. This was holy. This was God. Jacob didn't know what to call it. Didn't know what to make of it. But he knew, this was not about survival. This was about surrender. He had been fighting his whole life. For love. For blessing. For identity. But this fight was different. Because Jacob wasn't trying to win. He was trying to be changed. And somewhere in the exhaustion, in the grunting and grappling, the mysterious man touched Jacob's hip, and instantly, it shattered. Jacob collapsed. Broken. Wounded. But he wouldn't let go. Not this time. Through pain, through tears, he clung. I will not let you go unless you bless me, he whispered, or maybe cried. Not a demand. A desperation. Not arrogance. Surrender. And then, the question came, what is your name? It wasn't because God didn't know. It was because Jacob needed to say it. To confess it. Jacob, he answered. The deceiver. The supplanter. The struggler. It wasn't just a name. It was a history. A confession. An identity forged in fear and striving. But the man looked at him and said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel. Because you have wrestled with God and with men, and have prevailed. Prevailed? But Jacob was broken. Bleeding. Barely standing. And yet, that was the point. He had prevailed by yielding. He had won by surrendering. He had finally stopped running. That night didn't just leave him with a new name. It left him with a limp. A permanent reminder. That he had met God, and lived. Because some encounters don't leave you polished, they leave you marked. Some blessings come with a cost. And some breakthroughs come through brokenness. As the sun rose, Jacob limped toward it. Not as the man he had been. But as someone transformed. Israel. The one who wrestled with God, and was changed by it. And here's the truth, God didn't wrestle with Jacob to defeat him. He wrestled to redefine him. Because before God can truly use us, he often has to break the parts of us that were never meant to last. Jacob walked away wounded, but whole. Scarred, but seen. Not pretending. Not posturing. Just. Jacob. Finally real. Finally free. And that limp? That was the proof that something holy had happened. Some people measure transformation by what they gain. God measures it by what you're willing to lose to become who He created you to be. And that night, in the dirt, in the dark, Jacob lost his old self. And he found something better. A name. A future. A legacy. A man who used to grasp for blessings now carried one. Not stolen. Not forced. Given. Freely. Through grace. Through struggle. Through God. A limp that marks you. He walked away, limping. After the fight. After the blessing. After the name change. Jacob, now Israel, took his first steps into a new day with a wound he would carry forever. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a punishment. It was a mark. A divine signature. Because when you wrestle with God, you don't leave untouched. You leave transformed, sometimes through tears, sometimes through fire, and sometimes through a limp. Jacob had spent his whole life trying to stand strong. To appear unshakable. To outsmart, outrun, outlast. But now he walked differently. Slower. Softer. More aware. And with every painful step, he remembered, God touched me. That limp wasn't weakness. It was evidence. Proof that he had faced the one who cannot be seen and lived to tell the story. Sometimes we think strength is in perfection, in walking tall, chest out, head high. But the Bible tells a different story. A deeper one. The Apostle Paul would later write, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Jacob was now living that truth. He no longer had to pretend to be strong. He didn't have to wear someone else's clothes. Didn't have to chase approval. Didn't have to deceive or perform. The limp reminded him. God wasn't interested in the image he projected. He was after the man underneath. And that limp? It led him forward. Toward his brother. Toward reconciliation. Toward peace. Because when God marks you, He doesn't just change how you walk, He changes where you walk. He leads you back to the places you feared. The people you hurt. The truths you buried. But now you face them differently. Not with pride, but with humility. Not with fear, but with faith. Jacob had spent a lifetime chasing blessing. But now, he carried it, in his name, in his soul, and yes, even in his limp. Because some wounds aren't meant to be hidden. They're meant to remind us, grace met me here. God didn't let go. And I'm still walking, even if I limp. The fear of facing Esau the son was rising, and Jacob was limping toward the one thing he feared most, his brother, Esau. The last time Jacob saw him, he was fleeing for his life. Esau had been furious. Betrayed. Jacob had taken everything, his birthright, his blessing, his trust. And now, after decades of silence, Jacob was coming home. But Esau wasn't coming alone. He was bringing 400 men. This wasn't a reunion. This looked like war. Every step Jacob took stirred memories, of lies told, of masks worn, of choices that still haunted him. He tried to prepare. He sent gifts, herds of animals, wave after wave. An offering of peace. A desperate attempt to soften the blow. He divided his people. Strategized. Planned for survival. But deep down, he knew, no strategy could save him from this moment. Because this wasn't just about safety. It was about shame. Regret. And fear. The kind of fear that knots your stomach and steals your breath. The kind that makes you wonder, will I be punished for my past? Will grace be enough? Will he still want to kill me? Jacob prayed. Not with polished words, but raw desperation. Deliver me, he cried, for I fear him. And in that prayer, we hear the trembling heart of a man who finally stopped pretending. Jacob had wrestled with God, but now he had to face a man. A brother. A consequence. A mirror. And there, on the edge of the unknown, Jacob bowed 7 times as Esau approached. 7 steps of surrender. 7 acts of repentance. 7 moments that could have been his last. Because when you've hurt someone deeply, you don't get to write the ending. You just show up, humbled, exposed, and hope for mercy. Jacob had the blessing. He had the limp. He had the new name. But he didn't yet have peace. Not until Esau spoke. Not until eyes met. Not until wounds faced each other. And so he waited. With each step closer, his heart thundered inside his chest. The fear wasn't just about death. It was about rejection. About finally being seen, and possibly not being forgiven. But Jacob didn't run this time. He didn't hide. He didn't send someone else in his place. He walked, limping, straight into the heart of his past. Because healing doesn't come by avoiding what haunts you. It comes by facing it. And Jacob was ready. Or at least, willing. And sometimes, that's all faith is. Not confidence. But willingness, to show up broken and hope that grace is waiting. When forgiveness wins, he expected a sword. But he got an embrace. Jacob, heart pounding, face to the ground, waited for the blow that could end his life. Esau was close now, close enough to strike, to shout, to punish. But then, it happened. Not violence. Not revenge. Not wrath. Esau ran. He didn't walk. He didn't hesitate. He ran. Straight toward Jacob, the brother who had betrayed him. The man who had stolen everything. The reason for so many years of silence. And instead of drawing his weapon, Esau threw his arms around him. He embraced him. He wept. Not out of pain, but out of release. Because forgiveness had already done its work in Esau's heart, long before his feet ever stepped toward Jacob. And in that embrace, Jacob broke again. Not in fear this time, but in gratitude. Tears poured. Years melted. The weight of guilt and fear dissolved in an instant. Because some moments don't need speeches. They just need surrender. Forgiveness, true forgiveness, is not logical. It's not fair. It's not predictable. It's miraculous. Esau had every right to demand justice. To retaliate. To make Jacob pay for what he had done. But instead, he chose mercy. And in that choice, he didn't just free Jacob, he freed himself. Because forgiveness isn't just a gift for the offender. It's freedom for the one who's been hurt. That moment between the brothers, that tear-soaked embrace, was more than reconciliation. It was resurrection. What was dead came back to life. What was lost had been found. What was broken was being made whole. And Jacob? He didn't just receive forgiveness from Esau. He saw something else. He said, "To see your face is like seeing the face of God." Because in that moment, Esau mirrored the grace Jacob had received the night before. Undeserved. Unexplainable. And utterly holy. The man who had once stolen a blessing was now living one. Not through manipulation. But through mercy. Not through conquest. But through compassion. Because grace doesn't just come from heaven. Sometimes it wears human skin. Sometimes it has tear-filled eyes and arms that pull you close instead of pushing you away. Jacob had feared this day for so long. And now that it had come, he discovered something he never expected: forgiveness had already won. Not just in Esau, but in himself. Because sometimes, the hardest person to forgive is the one staring back in the mirror. And now, Jacob could finally look, and not turn away. From deceiver to redeemed, he began life grasping. Grasping for his brother's heel. Grasping for blessing. Grasping for identity. Always reaching. Always striving. Jacob spent years chasing things he thought would make him whole: love, security, status, control. But in the end, he discovered something deeper. You don't become whole by pretending. You don't become free by running. You don't become blessed by deceiving. You become whole when you wrestle. When you surrender. When you let God break the parts of you that were never meant to survive. Jacob's story isn't about a perfect man. It's about a real man. Flawed. Complicated. Afraid. And yet, chosen. Not because he got it all right. But because God saw what was possible beneath all the masks. God took the deceiver, and made him a father of nations. God took the struggler, and gave him a new name. God took the runner, and turned him into a man who could finally stand still, face the truth, and be redeemed. And that same God? He still changes people today. You don't have to have it all together. You don't have to fix yourself first. You don't have to fake strength to earn grace. Jacob's limp didn't disqualify him. It identified him. It said, "This one has met God, and lived." We all have limps. We all have pasts. But God can take the broken pieces and build something eternal. He did it with Jacob. He can do it with you. Because no one is too far gone. No one is too messed up. No one is beyond the reach of a God who wrestles with us, just to bless us. This is not just the story of a man who wrestled with God. It's the story of what happens when grace wins. And that story can still be written in you.